He walked into his own house, unannounced, and the cleaner clapped her hand over his mouth, not out of disrespect, but pure desperation. What she knew could shatter everything, or maybe, just maybe, save what was left. Hugh Aralho slipped in through the back door, quiet as a mouse. He wasn't the type to herald his arrival, never had been. But that afternoon, the quiet inside his sprawling house felt different. A weight he couldn't quite name, but his gut clenched before his mind even had a chance to catch up. His trip had been called off hours earlier. Contract sealed over the phone, meeting postponed, ticket unused. He'd rung Isabel twice on the way back. No answer. Sent a text. Nothing. Figured she was asleep or had her phone on silent, like she always did when she was at the salon or out with her mates. He didn't think twice about it. Should have. The back hallway was dim. Hugh tossed his keys onto the usual console table, loosened his tie, and headed for the stairs. He had a bunch of roses in his arm, creams and light pinks, full and fragrant. He'd picked them up on the way from the airport for Isabel, a rare gesture for him, but the contract he'd closed that day was the biggest in the company's history. He deserved to celebrate. Deserved, he thought, to do something a bit different. That's when he heard quick footsteps upstairs. Hugh froze in the middle of the hallway. He tilted his head slightly, the way you do when you're not quite sure what you heard and don't want to believe what you imagined. The steps didn't stop. There were two pairs, one heavier, one lighter, and muffled voices, urgent, almost whispered, like someone trying not to be heard. That's when Elsa appeared. She came out of the laundry room as if propelled by her own fear, a cloth in her hand, apron tied at her waist, hair pulled back. But what Hugh saw first wasn't any of that. It was her face, her eyes, wide, desperate, her mouth about to speak, but unable to. And then she did the unthinkable. She crossed the hallway in 3 quick steps and clapped her hand over the mouth of Hugh Aralho, the owner of the house, her boss, the most powerful man in that space, as if he were a child about to scream in the wrong place. Hugh recoiled instinctively. Anger surged, hot and fast, up his throat. Who was this woman to put her hand on him in his own home? He opened his mouth to speak, but her eyes stopped him cold. There was no arrogance in that gesture, just pure, unadulterated desperation, the kind that couldn't be faked. "Quiet, Mr. Aralho," she whispered, almost voiceless. "Please." Hugh stood motionless, the roses still in his arm, his tie loosened, his heart slowly starting to grasp what his head still refused. From upstairs, the footsteps continued, too quick for anyone just walking from room to room, too hurried for anyone with nothing to hide. "What's going on here?" he asked, controlling his tone with all the strength he had. Elsa didn't answer straight away. She looked at the ceiling, at where the noise was coming from, then looked back at Hugh with an expression he'd never seen on any employee's face. It wasn't fear of dismissal, not fear of punishment. It was the fear of someone carrying a burden they never asked for, and who knew the moment to let it go had come, and it was going to hurt. "I've been carrying this alone for weeks," she said, still in a low voice. "Every time you traveled, every time. I didn't know what to do. I thought about speaking up. I thought about leaving. But then I'd see you come home every day, working, trusting the wrong people, not knowing. Elsa." Hugh's voice came out firm, but there was a crack in it. "Tell me what's happening." She took a deep breath, pulled her phone from her apron pocket with a slightly trembling hand, unlocked the screen, and held it up for him to see. The video was short, just over 30 seconds, recorded by accident. She'd explain that later, but right now, what mattered was what was on the screen. The upstairs hallway. The phone had fallen, screen up, on the console table near the wall, and the angle caught exactly what was in front of it. The main bedroom door, ajar. And just outside that door, Phil Anderson, his assistant, his right-hand man, the man Hugh had treated like a younger brother for years, in a conversation that left no doubt whatsoever about what was going on. Hugh watched it once, then again. The bunch of roses slipped from his arm and landed on the floor without him even noticing. It was then that the footsteps upstairs stopped, and then came the sound no man ever wants to hear inside his own home. The sharp click of a door being quickly closed, followed by silence, the kind of silence that screamed volumes. Hugh lifted his eyes from the phone. Elsa was already looking at him, tears streaming down her face. Not pity, but that awful feeling of second-hand shame, the heartache of watching an injustice unfold for weeks, completely helpless. "How long?" he asked. His voice came out different, deeper, more guttural, as if from a place he didn't even know existed within himself. "Since your last long trip, Mr. Araujo, she replied. Maybe before, but that's when I started to notice. Hugh didn't say anything for a few seconds. He just stood there in the middle of the hallway. The very hallway he'd chosen when he renovated the estate, the flooring he'd approved, the walls he'd had painted, and for the first time, he felt that nothing there was real, that the entire house was just a shell, beautiful on the outside, rotten within. It was then they heard footsteps descending the stairs, slow, deliberate, like the steps of someone who had prepared for the moment before taking the first step. Isabel Araujo came down with the natural ease of someone who'd done nothing wrong. Hair in place, clothes perfect. The smile in place, that smile Hugh had loved for years, and which now looked like a plaster mask. She reached the bottom of the stairs, turned into the hallway, and stopped. The three of them stood in silence for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Isabel looked at Hugh, then at Elsa, then at the phone in his hand, and it was the first time her composure finally cracked. Just for an instant, a blink of an eye too long, a slightly quicker breath. But Hugh saw it. After so many years, he knew every minuscule gesture on that face. "You're back early," she said, as if commenting on the weather. Hugh looked at her for a long time, then looked at the bunch of roses on the floor, flowers he'd bought to celebrate with her, to be different for once, to surprise her. Their petals were already beginning to open on the cool tiles. He didn't answer. He lowered his eyes to the floor, then raised them back to Isabel's face, and what she saw in that gaze made her smile vanish forever. "You don't know anything yet, Mr. Araujo," Elsa had said minutes earlier, and she was right, because the video was only the beginning. What was hidden inside that house, in the documents, in the plans, in the conversations he'd never overheard, was much bigger than any betrayal that could fit into 30 seconds of footage. And Elsa Mackenzie, the cleaner no one ever really saw, was the only person in that house who knew everything. Isabel went back upstairs to the bedroom without saying a word. She didn't run, she didn't cry. She climbed with that same usual calm, as if the scene in the hallway was just a minor setback, something time would resolve. And it was exactly that calm that shattered Hugh internally, more than any explanation could have done. He stood in the hallway for a time he couldn't measure, the bunch still on the floor, the roses open, indifferent to what had just happened around them. Elsa didn't leave. She stood 2 steps away, quiet, not pushing any words. It was the kind of presence that asked for nothing and offered everything, the kind most people never learned to have. "Sit down," Hugh finally said, pointing to the seats in the kitchen nook. His voice was tired, not from sleep, but from the weight. Elsa sat, and so did he. And for the first time in all the years she'd worked in that house, they were on the same level. No boss at the head of the table, no employee standing, waiting for orders. "Tell me everything," he said. From the beginning. She took a deep breath, clasped her hands on the table, and began. It had started weeks ago, on an ordinary afternoon when Hugh was away for a round of meetings that would last days. Elsa was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard the doorbell. Doug, the security guard, was outside looking after the gate. Isabel asked Elsa to open the door. It was Phil, Clear's throat. That in itself wasn't strange. Phil came in and out of the house frequently, always with some work-related justification. Documents, contracts, pending signatures. Hugh trusted him blindly. So, the assistant's presence never raised suspicion from anyone. But that afternoon, something was different. Phil came in without a briefcase, without a folder, without any papers in his hands. He greeted Elsa with a smile she described as too broad for someone who'd come to work. Isabel met him in the entry hall, and the two went upstairs together, without any explanation. Door closed. Silence. Elsa continued cleaning. It wasn't in her nature to snoop into other people's lives. She'd learned early on that a curious employee didn't last long on the job. But the following week, it happened again, and the week after, again. Always when Hugh was away, always without a briefcase, without a folder, without any documents. Always with that broad smile from Phil, and that calculated coldness from Isabel, who received visitors as if expecting something. The third time, Elsa said, looking at the table, I realized it was wrong, too wrong to ignore. Hugh listened without interrupting, his jaw clenched, his fingers still on the table. The video you saw was an accident, she continued. I'd just finished cleaning the hallway and left my phone on the console table near the door. When I went to get it, the video had recorded itself. It slipped into my pocket by accident and kept recording. I didn't even notice at the time. I only saw it that night when I checked my phone before bed. She paused, breathed. I kept looking at that recording for ages. I thought about deleting it. I thought it wasn't my business. I thought I'd lose my job if I spoke up. But then I thought about you, Mr. Araujo. coming home every day with that look, like you still believed in what you had here inside. Her voice broke slightly. She didn't let the emotion take over, but the effort to hold it back was visible, and I couldn't delete it. Hugh looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, towards the window, to the garden outside, to the trees he'd had planted when he bought the house, full of plans and certainties that now seemed like a joke. "Is there more?" he said. It wasn't a question. Elsa nodded. "Does Doug know?" "Yes," she said the word slowly, as if knowing each syllable would sting. "Doug saw Phil arriving more than once. He tried to tell me, but Mrs. Araujo realized he was suspicious, called him for a private chat, and told him if he opened his mouth to anyone, he'd be on the street before the end of the day. Doug has a family to support. Mr. Araujo. He has a young child." He kept quiet. Hugh closed his eyes for a second, opened them. "And you? Did she try to silence you too? Try to fire you?" Elsa answered without beating around the bush. "Twice. Said I was slow, that my work had slipped, that she wanted someone more experienced. But you always intervened without knowing the real reason. You always said I was a good employee and there was no reason for a change." She paused briefly. "You defended me without knowing you were defending me." The sentence hung in the air and stayed there. Hugh slowly rose from his chair, walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, the posture of a man who needed a second not to collapse in front of anyone. His shoulders rose and fell in a long, deep, controlled breath. Then he turned around. "Elsa, the video only shows the hallway. It shows Phil coming out of the room, but it's not enough proof for anything. Not yet." He spoke with his mind already working, already analyzing, already planning the next step. "Is there anything else? Anything you saw, heard, kept?" She hesitated, and that hesitation lasted long enough for Hugh to understand there was more, and what was coming was worse. "Once," she began carefully, "I was cleaning your study. The door was ajar. I wasn't listening on purpose. I was wiping down the bookshelf near the wall, and I heard Phil on the phone outside in the hallway. He didn't see me. What did he say?" Elsa clasped her hands again, looked directly at Hugh. "He said, once he signs the power of attorney, the business changes hands in less than 15 days. She'll handle the rest from inside." The silence that settled in that kitchen nook was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of when a person understands, all at once and completely, that they've been surrounded on all sides, and that the trap had been built for much longer than they imagined. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a calculated, organized plan, with deadlines and defined roles for everyone. Isabel on the inside, Phil on the outside, and Hugh in the center, completely unaware, signing contracts, closing deals, building a company that other people planned to take over. Power of attorney. Hugh repeated the words softly, as if he needed to hear them in his own voice to believe. There was a power of attorney in progress. His solicitor had mentioned it the previous week, a routine document, he'd said, to facilitate operations while Hugh was on long trips. Hugh had asked Phil to look after the details. Phil had looked after them, all right, but the details that mattered to him. Hugh looked at Elsa with an expression she would never forget. It wasn't anger, it wasn't despair. It was the look of a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him had always been false, and he hadn't fallen because a simple woman, invisible to everyone else, had been holding it up, unasked. "Why did you do it?" he asked. The voice came out almost involuntarily. "Why didn't you just leave and let it go? It wasn't your obligation." Elsa looked up at him, and when she replied, the sentence came out whole, without hesitation, like something she'd thought many times before, saying aloud, "Because someone needed to be honest in this house, Mr. Araujo, and that someone was me." Hugh spent the night in his study. He didn't sleep, didn't try. He sat in the leather chair behind his desk, where he'd signed contracts worth millions, where he'd made decisions that changed the company's trajectory, where he'd built brick by brick everything he had. And now he was there in the dark, looking at those same walls, as if they were strangers. Elsa had gone home in the late afternoon after he'd asked her to rest. Before leaving, she paused at the study door and stood for a second without speaking, like someone wanting to say something but unsure if it was the right time. Hugh looked at her and made a small gesture with his head, a gesture that said, "I'm okay, even if I'm not." She left. And the silence that remained was the heaviest that house had ever held. Isabel didn't come down again. No words, no attempt at conversation, no sign that there was anything to explain or resolve, just the silence from upstairs. That calculated silence of someone who knows time works in favor of those who wait. And it was this silence that awakened something in Hugh. Not anger. He knew anger. He knew how it burned and how it faded. What awakened was something else, colder, more precise. The clarity of someone who understands that crying solves nothing, and that the only possible path from there was to understand the exact size of the hole before starting to climb out of it. He started in the study. He opened drawers he hadn't opened in months, folders he'd left for Phil to organize, files he'd signed without careful reading because he'd always trusted. And the more he leafed through, the more the picture formed. Not all at once, but gradually, like eyes adjusting to the dark and starting to see what had always been there. There were contracts with clauses he hadn't verbally approved, quota redistributions that looked like typos but weren't, a power of attorney document, the same one his solicitor had mentioned as routine, with an expanded scope that Hugh had never authorized, expanded enough that with one signature, Phil could operate the company as if he were the owner. Hugh placed the document on the desk, stared at it for a long time, then picked up the phone and sent a message to his personal solicitor, not the firm's lawyer, who'd been vetted by Phil in the hiring process, his own, the one he'd always used. 3 words: need to see you. Early in the morning, before any other staff arrived, Doug knocked on the study door. He entered, hat in hand, an old-fashioned gesture of a man raised with respect, and stood by the door, as if unsure if he deserved to be in the same room as his boss. "I know I don't have the right to be here," he said without preamble. "You do, Doug," Hugh replied. "Sit." Doug sat on the edge of the chair, recounted everything he'd held back. Every time Phil arrived, every time Isabel called him for that private chat, every veiled threat wrapped in cordiality. He spoke non-stop for almost 20 minutes, and when he finished, he had the face of someone who had just dropped a weight they'd been carrying on their back for far too long. "She said she'd destroy me if I opened my mouth," he said. "Said she'd claim I'd gone missing with things from the house, that no one would believe me." He paused. "I have a child, Mr. Hugh, a little boy. I couldn't risk it." "I know," Hugh said, and he meant it, without judgment, without resentment, because he'd spent the entire night understanding that Isabel had built a network of silence within his own house, and that each silenced person had been silenced with a different currency. Doug with fear, Elsa with the attempted dismissal, and Hugh himself with trust, which is the most precious currency of all, because once it's gone, it never returns the same. It was then that Isabel came downstairs. She entered the room where Hugh and Doug were. She assessed the scene in less than 2 seconds, as she always did, that quick, precise reading of an environment that Hugh had admired for years without understanding. It was a skill of someone who lived by calculation. And she turned to Doug with a slight smile. "Doug, could you give us a moment?" It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. Doug looked at Hugh. Hugh gave a discreet nod. "You can go." The security guard left, closed the door, and the two were alone for the first time since Hugh had returned. Isabel sat on the other side of the desk, with the natural ease of someone called for a business meeting. She clasped her hands, looked at her husband. "I know what you're thinking," she began. "You don't," Hugh replied. She ignored him. "Things got complicated. I know it looks worse than it is, but there's an explanation for everything. And if you give me a chance to, Isabel." Hugh's voice came out without anger, without volume, almost gentle. And that's exactly why she stopped. "I spent the entire night in this study. I read every document Phil organized over the last few months. I've already called my solicitor." Her smile didn't disappear, but her eyes changed. "This is an overreaction," she said, still controlled. "You're reacting in the heat of the moment. Tomorrow, the power of attorney," he interrupted. "Did you know about the scope he put in it?" A short, but real, pause. "I don't understand legal documents," she replied. "Yes, you do." Hugh leaned slightly forward. "You understand everything that benefits you. Always have. It just took me too long to see it." Isabel was silent for a moment, and then, like an actress deciding to switch characters mid-stage, her posture changed. The smile vanished. The calculation remained. "What do you want?" she asked. Direct, cold, the real version. "The truth," he replied. Just once. She looked at him for a long time, and Hugh realized in that look that the truth wouldn't come, not because she couldn't tell it, but because that had never been the plan. The plan was different. It always had been. It was then that Isabel's phone vibrated on the desk. She didn't pick it up, but her eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, involuntary, uncontrollable, and Hugh saw the name on the screen before she covered it with her hand. Phil. Hugh looked at her hand over the phone, looked at her face, and understood that Phil hadn't disappeared. He was waiting, waiting to know what had happened when Hugh arrived, waiting for instructions, waiting for the next step of a plan that hadn't been completely unraveled yet. Hugh slowly stood up, walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and in that moment, he made a decision he wouldn't go back on. When he turned, his face was set, resolved. "You can answer it," he said, pointing to the phone, "but know that every word of that call will be the last you two exchange, thinking you still have control of anything." Isabel didn't answer, and her silence was the first real confession she'd made since that whole story began. Outside the study, Elsa was arriving for work. She passed down the hallway, heard the heavy silence behind the closed door, and kept walking. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew, with that simple wisdom of someone who'd seen some proper tough times, that there were moments when the best thing someone could do for another was to let them face alone what only they could face. But she stayed close by, as she always had. The roses were still on the hallway floor. Elsa found them like that when she arrived, open, scattered, some petals already loose on the cool tiles. She stood in front of them for a moment, not quite knowing what to do. There was something about those discarded flowers that hurt in a nameless way. They weren't old flowers, discarded past their prime. These were fresh, bought with intention, carrying a meaning that never reached its destination. She gathered them carefully, one by one. She didn't throw them out. She placed them in a tall vase in the kitchen nook, filled it with water, and arranged them as if they were important, because they were, even if no one else in that house knew it but her. Elsa's apron lay nearby, vase on one side, apron on the other, on the same benchtop. And in that contrast, there was an entire story that needed no words to tell. Hugh was in the study when she knocked. He'd spent the morning on the phone with his personal solicitor, a long, technical conversation that revealed layers of a problem bigger than a single night's analysis could contain. The solicitor had asked for calm and absolute secrecy. No sudden moves, no direct confrontation with Phil yet, no visible alteration to the routine that could alert the other side. Hugh had nodded as he listened, but inside, each instruction to wait cost him more than the last. When Elsa knocked, he told her, "Come in a voice more tired than he intended. She entered with a cup of coffee, placed it on the desk without a sound. She was about to leave when Hugh spoke. "The flowers," he said. "Did you put them in the vase?" She stopped, turned. "Yes, Mr. Araujo. I hope it wasn't wrong." "No," he said. He looked at the cup. "I bought them to celebrate. Closed the biggest contract in the company's history." Pause. Wanted to give them to her. Elsa didn't reply. She stood by the door, not leaving, not moving closer, just present. "You know what's worse?" Hugh continued, and in his voice, there was something that wasn't anger nor sadness, but a nameless mixture of the two. "It's not what she did. It's that I was happy. Coming home, happy, with flowers in my hand, thinking about what her face would look like when I told her about the contract." He stopped. "I still believed, right up until I walked through that door, I still believed in everything." The sentence hung in the air. Elsa took 2 steps towards the desk and sat in the chair opposite him, not because she was invited, but because there was a point where the formality between two people was less significant than the weight of what was being said. Hugh didn't find it strange, didn't even seem to notice. He was staring at a fixed spot on the wall, in that way of someone who isn't really seeing what they're looking at. "Once," Elsa began slowly, "I also believed in someone who didn't deserve it." Hugh shifted his gaze to her. "My old boss, years ago, promised me a proper contract, superannuation, job security. I stayed for 2 years without complaining about anything, accepting late pay, accepting disrespect, because I believed the promise would come true one day." She paused briefly. "When he went broke, I was the last to know and the first to be left with nothing." Hugh was looking at her now with real attention. "What did you do?" he asked. "Cried for 3 days, she replied, without drama. On the 4th, so my mum wouldn't see, because my mum already had enough problems without carrying mine too." Small pause. "On the 4th day, I got up, sent out my resume, found this job, and learned that trusting is different from being naive, but that one doesn't stop the other from hurting just as much when it goes wrong." Hugh was silent for a moment. "Your mum," he said. "You talk about her sometimes. She lives a fair way off, in a quiet suburb on the other side of town." Elsa's face softened slightly, became more open. "Nan Lu. She hasn't been in the best of health for a while now. I send money every month, visit when I can, which isn't always when I want." She looked at her own hands. "It's what makes me work with determination every day, knowing she's okay because I'm here." Hugh nodded slowly. There was something in that which touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Not pity, but recognition The recognition that there was an entire person behind that apron, an entire story, a life with weight and love and sacrifice that existed completely independently of that house and everything that happened within it. "Elsa," he said, "why have you never asked for anything in all these years? I don't remember you asking for even a single favor." She looked at him with a tranquil expression. "Because that's not how I operate, Mr. Araujo." Hugh's phone vibrated on the desk. "Phil." They both looked at the screen at the same time. Hugh took a deep breath. His solicitor had said, "Don't alter the routine. Don't show you know. Let the other side make the first move," he answered. "Phil." His voice came out normal, controlled. Years of building a company had taught Hugh to negotiate with a poker face and an open voice, and never had that skill been so necessary as in that second. "Hugh." Phil's voice on the other end was warm, animated, with that usual energy. "Mate, heard you were back early. Everything all right? Any issues with the trip?" "None. Contract closed over the phone." "Oh, great." The enthusiasm was just a bit too perfect. "I need to drop by sometime this week so we can align on a few things. Got some documents that need your signature." Hugh closed his eyes for half a second. The power of attorney. Phil still didn't know he'd read everything. Still thought the plan was solid, that he just needed to show up with the right papers at the right time, and Hugh would sign without question, as he had done so many times before. "You can come tomorrow morning," Hugh said. "We'll sort everything out. Perfect. See you tomorrow." Then, the call ended. Elsa was looking at him. She hadn't asked anything, but her eyes asked everything. "He's coming tomorrow," Hugh said, placing the phone on the desk with a calmness he didn't feel inside. "And when he arrives, every document he brings will be analyzed by my solicitor before any pen gets near the paper." Elsa nodded slowly. "And Mrs. Araujo?" she asked carefully. Hugh looked at the window. Outside, the garden was the same as always, green, well-kept, beautiful on the surface, just like everything in that house had been for so long. "Isabel will understand tonight that the rules have changed," he replied. "No fuss, no scene, but she'll understand." He paused. "Some things don't need a shout to be said for good." Elsa stood up to leave, reached the door, stopped, and without turning completely, said something that echoed in that study long after she had gone. "You brought flowers to celebrate an achievement. The achievement is still yours. The flowers just went to the wrong place." Hugh looked at the closed door for a long time. Then he looked at the cup of coffee she had brought, still warm, still there in the midst of it all. And for the first time in those 2 days, he took a truly deep breath. Phil Anderson arrived punctually, suit tailored, leather briefcase in hand, that same familiar smile. Broad, confident, the smile of someone entering a place believing they're still welcome. Hugh met him at the entrance of the house, with a firm handshake and an expression that gave absolutely nothing away. Years of negotiation were precisely for this. "Mate, good to see you," Phil said, walking in as if it were his own house. He looked around with that natural ease of someone who knew every corner. "Everything all right here?" "Everything," Hugh replied. "Come to the study." Elsa was in the hallway when the two passed. She lowered her head and continued what she was doing, but her eyes followed Phil for a second. That second was all she needed. He didn't even glance at her. To Phil, Elsa was furniture. She always had been. And that blindness, that inability to see someone standing 2 meters away, serving coffee and wiping down surfaces, that was the very mistake that unraveled everything. In the study, the two sat down. Phil opened his briefcase with his usual efficiency, arranged the documents on the desk, and began to explain each one with that fluency of someone who had rehearsed well. Hugh listened, nodded, asked simple, technical questions that seemed like normal queries from someone paying attention, and Phil kept talking until he got to the power of attorney. "This is the document we need to finalize soon," he said, pushing the page towards Hugh naturally. "It's a formality, as Dr. Hayes would have explained, just to ensure agility in operations while you're traveling." Hugh picked up the document, read it, turned the page, read more. "This scope here," he said, pointing to a specific paragraph, "wasn't in the version Dr. Hayes presented to me." Phil blinked quickly, almost imperceptibly. "Must have been an update," he replied, recovering his tone in less than 2 seconds. "Legal made some technical adjustments to cover more situations." "It's standard." Hugh repeated the word slowly. "Exactly." Hugh placed the document back on the desk, clasped his hands, and looked at Phil with such absolute calm that the assistant, for the first time since he had entered that study, felt something shift in the air. "Phil," Hugh cleared his throat, said, "How long have you worked for me?" "Almost 6 years, he replied quickly, a reflex. 6 years. Hugh nodded. "In that time, have I treated you well?" "Very well." Always. Did I give you opportunity, autonomy, a salary above market rate? Yes. Phil's voice was slightly different now, more cautious. Then explain one thing to me. Hugh leaned slightly forward. Why did you do it? The silence that settled was of a specific kind. The silence of someone caught, who hasn't yet decided which version they'll use. I don't know what you're talking about, Phil said, controlled, firm. Yes, you do. Hugh opened a drawer and placed a different folder on the desk, organized by his solicitor the night before, with copies of every altered document, every modified clause, every irregular movement from the past few months. My solicitor spent the entire night organizing this. Not Dr. Hayes, my solicitor, the one you don't know. Phil looked at the folder, looked at Hugh, and for the first time that morning, the smile vanished. This is a misunderstanding, he tried. It's not. Hugh opened the folder and turned it towards Phil. Quota redistribution without formal authorization, clauses inserted into contracts after my signature, and a power of attorney with a scope that removes my operational control of the company for an indefinite period. Pause. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a plan. Phil, clears throat, remained silent, and that silence said everything any words would have denied. I want you to leave the folder here, Hugh said. Leave the documents and leave this house now. The rest will be sorted out by the solicitors. Phil didn't move immediately. There was something on his face. Not remorse, but calculation. The final analysis of someone still looking for an escape route where none existed anymore. Then he closed his own briefcase, stood up, and straightened his suit with a mechanical gesture. At the study door, he stopped. You'll regret not hearing my side of the story, he said. I've heard versions my whole life, Hugh replied. I've learned to prefer documents. Phil left. His footsteps in the hallway faded until they vanished. The front door closed, and that simple, definitive sound was the end of 6 years of trust that had never been real. Elsa was in the kitchen nook when Phil passed through the hallway for the last time. She didn't look up, didn't say anything, but she felt that strange, heavy relief when something wrong finally stops happening. Minutes later, Doug knocked on the kitchen nook door. He's gone, he said, his voice still disbelieving. I know, Elsa replied. Doug stood in the doorway. He had the face of someone who wanted to speak, but didn't know how to start. Then he spoke. Elsa, I should have said something sooner. I should have spoken up when I first saw it. I know you paid the price for it. All those times she tried to get rid of you, the weight you carried alone. He stopped. I'm sorry. Elsa looked at him for a moment. You have a young child, she said. I understand. Understanding isn't the same as being right. No, she agreed, but it's also not the same as being a bad character. You were scared. That's human. Doug nodded, unable to respond further. He left with that expression of someone who had received more than he thought he deserved. That same afternoon, Isabel received the notification. It wasn't Hugh who delivered it. It was the solicitor, formally, as arranged. An official letter with a stamp and protocol, which arrived while she was in the living room, reading a magazine, as if the world around her wasn't completely reorganizing itself. Elsa was passing through the hallway when she heard the sound of paper being opened. Then silence. Then the sound of Isabel slowly placing the magazine on the table, with that calm of someone who still refused to let anything show on her face. But Elsa had stopped near the half-open door unintentionally, and what she saw was only a second. Isabel with the paper in her hand, her eyes scanning the lines, and an expression that lasted less than 3 seconds before being tucked away again. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. The recognition of someone who understood that the game was over and she had lost. Elsa kept walking. There was no satisfaction in it. It had never been about satisfaction. It was about the end of a lie that had lasted too long and hurt those who didn't deserve to be hurt. In the study, Hugh was on the phone with the company partners, calling the meeting his solicitor had advised, with every piece of evidence organized, every irregularity documented. His voice was firm, direct, the voice of a man who had lost a lot in the past few days, but hadn't lost himself. She passed the study door and, without stopping, without making a sound, left a cup of coffee on the console table in the hallway, outside, within reach, for when he needed it. Hugh saw it out of the corner of his eye, didn't stop talking, but raised 2 fingers of his hand, a small, almost invisible gesture. Thanks. And Elsa moved on. The letter arrived on Hugh's desk one ordinary morning. It wasn't from the solicitor, not from the company. It was a simple envelope, unfranked, with neat, careful handwriting, of someone who had learned to write with care, because paper and pen were serious business. He opened it slowly, as if he already felt, before reading, that it would cost him something inside. "Mr. Hugh, I apologize for not telling you in person. I didn't have the courage. I know you're going through a very difficult time, and the last thing I wanted was to be another burden. I did what I thought was right to do. If I made a mistake in anything, please forgive me. It was a privilege to work in this house. Elsa Mackenzie." Hugh read it twice. He folded the paper calmly, put it in his pocket, then called Doug. "Do you know where she lives?" Doug knew immediately what he was talking about. He picked up his phone, opened Elsa's contact, and read the address aloud. A suburb on the other side of town, a simple name, a numbered street, without any of the adjectives people use when talking about beautiful places. Hugh grabbed his car keys. "Don't you want me to call the driver?" Doug asked. "No." Hugh was already walking towards the garage. "Today, I'll go alone." The suburb was different from everything that surrounded Hugh Araujo's life. It wasn't poverty-stricken, just simple, with that quiet dignity of a place where people worked hard and didn't complain much. Small houses with low fences, uneven footpaths, gum trees growing a bit crooked but still thriving. Kids in the street, the sound of a television through an open window, the smell of home-cooked food. Hugh parked his car, which was far too fancy for that street, and he knew it, and he sat for a second inside it. He looked at the house number, an iron gate, a plant in the window, a plastic chair on the footpath that seemed to be someone's favorite spot. He got out, clapped at the gate. It took a while. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who took the time they needed and didn't apologize for it. The gate opened. Nan Lu had the face of someone who had lived a lot and held on to everything. White hair, dark, watchful eyes, the posture of a woman whose body had bent under years of hard work, but whose character never had. She looked Hugh up and down, without intimidation, without ceremony, with the direct assessment of someone with no time or patience for idle chatter. "I know who you are, Mr. Araujo," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement. "Nan Lu," Hugh replied, with more respect in his voice than he used in meetings with multinational directors. "May I come in?" She opened the gate without answering. What Hugh would learn in the following minutes was her way of saying yes. The house inside was small and immaculate. Clean floors, simple furniture arranged with care, that smell of an old home that wasn't mold or dust. It was history accumulated in the walls. On the living room shelf, a photograph, Elsa, younger, perhaps 10 years, embracing Nan Lu in front of a local church, both smiling the way you smile when there's no professional photographer or posed shot, smiling truly. Hugh looked at the photo for a second longer than he intended. "Sit," Nan Lu said, pointing to the sofa. "I'll call her." "You knew I'd come?" he asked, surprised. Nan Lu stopped at the hallway entrance, turned her face halfway, that profile of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "I raised my daughter to do the right thing," she said. "When a person does the right thing, there are always consequences. Good or bad, they always come." Short pause. "I've been expecting you since she told me what she'd done," and she went down the hallway. Elsa took a few minutes to appear. When she came out of the room, she was different. Not the house cleaner from the estate, not the woman in an apron and hairnet. It was just her, in simple clothes, hair down, and an expression that mixed surprise with that resignation of someone who had mentally prepared for a difficult moment. When she saw Hugh sitting on the sofa in her living room, that man she had always known from the other side of an invisible but real hierarchy, she stopped at the hallway entrance. "Mr. Hugh," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was a visible effort behind it. "Elsa." Hugh stood up, took the envelope from his pocket, her letter, and placed it on the coffee table between them. "You could have told me in person. I didn't know how," she replied honestly. "You have a lot to sort out. I didn't want to." "You didn't want to bother me," he interrupted. "I know. You never want to bother anyone. In all these years, you never asked for anything, never complained about anything, never put your name before anyone else's." Pause. "And that's exactly why everyone walked all over you, as if you weren't even there." Elsa remained silent. "Isabel tried to fire you twice," Hugh continued. "Phil ignored you as if you were invisible, and you stayed there, quiet, holding a secret that wasn't yours, protecting a man who didn't even know he needed protecting." His voice shifted slightly, not in tone, but in texture. It became less formal, more real. "Why did you leave without letting me say anything?" Elsa crossed her arms, not in defense, but in that gesture of someone trying to hold themselves together while speaking. "Because I'm scared of wanting things that aren't for me," she said. The sentence came out low, almost just for herself, but the room was small, and the silence was great. and Hugh heard every word. Nan Lu, who had been standing at the kitchen entrance, pretending not to listen, closed her eyes for a second. Hugh took out a different, larger envelope from his pocket. He placed it next to her letter on the coffee table. "You can open it," he said. Elsa looked at the envelope, looked at him, then approached slowly, picked it up, and opened it with that care of someone who doesn't know what they'll find, but has learned that surprises require preparation. It wasn't a check, it wasn't money. It was a handwritten letter on personal letterhead, not from the company, not from the solicitor, but from him. Elsa began to read, and the more she read, the more her posture changed, her shoulders dropping, her jaw relaxing, her eyes brightening with a moisture she held back for as long as she could. The letter said, in direct, unembellished words, that Elsa Mackenzie had been the only truly honest person in that house. For all the time, the lie had lasted. That what she had done was not part of any employment contract, that she had chosen when she could have chosen the path of least resistance, and that a choice like that, made without an audience or guaranteed reward, was the kind of rare thing that needed to be acknowledged, not with silence, but with words truly spoken. At the end of the letter, there was a paragraph that Elsa read twice. "Doug told me that you study at night to finish high school, that you pay for this course yourself every month, without telling anyone. I won't give you money, not because I don't want to, but because I know you wouldn't accept it. So, I'm offering you something else, an opportunity. The group has a professional development program that funds studies for employees with leadership potential. You've always had that potential. The position is yours, if you want it. The decision is entirely yours." Elsa lowered the paper. The tears came, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention. They came in the silent way of someone who had held too much for too long, and who, at a certain point, the body simply decides, enough is enough. Nan Lu crossed the room unhurriedly, sat beside her daughter, took her hand with that calm firmness of a mother who doesn't need words to say everything. Hugh stood still, respecting that moment that wasn't his, it was theirs. After a while, Nan Lu looked up at him and said with that voice of someone who had weighed every word before letting it go, "Did you know, Mr. Araujo, that this girl gave up a lot to look after me?" "Mum?" Elsa tried. "No." Nan Lu was firm, but without harshness. "He needs to know." To Hugh, "She had a better job offer, better pay, better hours, closer to home. That's when my health became delicate. She refused the offer, stayed in the job she had so she wouldn't lose stability while I needed care." She paused. "She never told me that. I found out from someone else months later." The room fell quiet. Hugh looked at Elsa, who had her eyes downcast. That posture of someone exposed in a secret she kept not out of shame, but out of an excess of care for the other. "Why didn't you tell her?" he asked. Elsa looked up, replied without hesitation, "Because she already carried enough. She didn't need to carry guilt on top of it." Nan Lu squeezed her daughter's hand with more, Clear's throat, strength, and it was that image, those two hands together, one old and one young, one full of history and the other full of future, that stayed in Hugh Araujo's memory long after that day. When he left, it was already getting dark. At the door, Elsa accompanied him to the gate. The two stood for a second on the footpath, with that good strangeness of when a relationship has changed, and neither of them quite knows the name of what it's become. "The spot in the program," Hugh said. "You don't have to decide now." "I've already decided," she replied. He looked at her. "I accept the opportunity," she said, "but I'm coming back to work because I want to, not because I need to." "There's a difference." "There is," Hugh agreed, and on his face, there was something that hadn't been there when that week had begun. It wasn't joy, but something more substantial than joy. It was the expression of someone who had lost a lot all at once, but in the midst of that loss, he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. He opened his car door. Before getting in, he stopped. "Elsa, one last thing." She waited. "That night, when you could have deleted the video and forgotten everything, what went through your mind?" She thought for a second, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was choosing the right words for something that was too simple to need complicated language. "I thought if it were me, I'd want someone to do the same." Hugh nodded, got into his car, started the engine, and as he drove away from that simple street, with its low houses and crooked trees, and children still playing on the footpath even as the day closed in, he felt for the first time in many years that he was driving away from a place, not fleeing. There was a difference, and he finally knew what it was. A few weeks later, the house breathed differently. It wasn't a difference you could see. The walls were the same, the garden looked identical. The floor was still as polished as it always had been. It was a difference you could feel, like when a house stops keeping secrets and goes back to being just a house. Like when the air inside a place stops being heavy and becomes simply air. Isabel had left without a scene, without a shout, without tears, without the drama someone from outside might expect from a separation of that magnitude. She left with her bags packed and her solicitor beside her. The lawyer had arrived 2 days after the notification, attempted a final negotiation that Hugh's solicitor met with enough documentation to shut down any argument, and left through the same door she had entered. Isabel followed. She didn't look back. There was something in that departure, without looking back, that said more about who she was than any confession would have. Phil was facing the consequences of his own choices far away, removed from the company, with legal proceedings underway, conducted by the solicitors with the precision of someone who had evidence for every line of the accusation. Hugh didn't talk about it with anyone, not because he was hiding it, but because he had learned in those weeks that certain things, once resolved, didn't need retelling. They simply ceased to exist in the daily routine, and the silence around them was the best way to move on. The company had undergone an internal reorganization. The partners, gathered with all the evidence on the table, made quick and precise decisions. The power of attorney was never signed, the damage was contained, and the multi-million-dollar contract Hugh had closed that afternoon, the same one that had motivated the bunch of roses, the same one that had brought him back earlier than expected, came into effect without any obstacles. Sometimes life saves us by accident. Elsa returned one weekday morning, just like so many other mornings she had arrived at that house over the years, but it wasn't the same, and they both knew it. She entered through the front door, not because Hugh had ordered her to, but because he had left it open, and there was something in that small gesture that said, without needing words, that the entrances to this house no longer had a hierarchy. The new contract was on the kitchen nook table. Hugh had asked his solicitor to draft it carefully. Revised salary, respected hours, full entitlements, and a clause that Elsa read twice before she believed it. Participation in the group's professional development program with full funding for her studies for as long as necessary. She signed it with the same pen he had used, without excessive ceremony, with that quiet seriousness of someone who understood the gravity of her actions, without needing to make a spectacle of it. Doug, who had stood by the door as a silent witness, took a deep breath when he saw the signature. No one said anything. Sometimes, silence is the fullest sound there is. Days later, Hugh passed through the kitchen in the late afternoon and found the vase with the dried flowers still on the bench top. They were the roses from the bunch, the ones Elsa had collected from the hallway floor weeks ago and arranged in a vase with water, as if they deserved to end better than they began. The water had dried up long ago. The petals were closed and dark, but still in place, untouched. Hugh stared at them for a moment, then picked up the vase, went to the bin, and emptied the flowers with a simple, definitive gesture. He washed the vase, dried it, placed it back on the bench top, empty, clean, waiting. The next day, before Elsa arrived, he left early. He didn't go to a florist, didn't buy a bunch wrapped in cellophane with a ribbon. He went to the local market 2 streets up, where an old lady sold flowers out of plastic buckets, with that informality of something that didn't need to impress anyone. He bought a handful of simple flowers, the kind without famous names or prices that would appear on an invoice. He returned home, placed them in the small vase that was waiting on the kitchen window. Not too much water, no forced arrangement, just the flowers in the right place. He stood looking at it for a second and felt it was the most honest thing he had placed inside that house in a long time. Elsa arrived as she always did, punctual, silent, with that presence that didn't announce itself and didn't ask permission to exist. She entered through the front door, walked down the hallway, reached the kitchen, and stopped. The flowers were there, simple, open, with that vibrant color of something freshly picked, in the small vase on the window, where the morning light hit sideways and made everything seem more real than it should. Elsa stood at the kitchen entrance for a few seconds. She didn't say anything, didn't call anyone, just looked at those flowers with an expression that was hard to name. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief, it wasn't gratitude, but it was something that contained all of that at once and still left room for more. Then, she put her bag on a chair, put on her apron, and started her day. A few weeks later, on a weekday evening, Elsa arrived later than usual. Hugh was in his study when he heard the door. He stayed quiet, but Doug, who was doing his rounds in the hallway, appeared at the study entrance with a discreet smile. "She just got here," he said, "straight from class." Hugh nodded. The semester had started. Elsa was attending night classes with the regularity of someone who doesn't waste an opportunity and the seriousness of someone who knows the cost of getting there. The program supervisor had sent an informal report to Hugh the previous week. 2 short paragraphs he read in one, go and put in a drawer. Exemplary participation. Stood out among peers. Clear leadership potential. Hugh had smiled to himself upon reading it, not out of surprise, but recognition, like someone confirming in words what you already knew all along. One afternoon, Nanlu appeared at the house. Elsa didn't know. Hugh had called and invited her, and the mother had accepted with that direct simplicity of someone who makes no fuss about a sincere invitation. She arrived by bus with a fabric bag on her arm, and those watchful eyes that assessed everything without judgment. Hugh met her at the door. Nanlu entered, looked around at the high ceilings, at the expensive furniture, at the garden outside, and then looked at Hugh, with that direct expression he had already learned to recognize as her way of being honest. "It's a beautiful house," she said, but it seemed colder before. Hugh didn't know whether to laugh or agree. He did both. When Elsa came from the back of the house and found her mother sitting in the kitchen nook with a cup of tea in her hand, chatting with her boss as if it were routine, she stopped at the door with an expression that had no adequate name in any language. "Mum," she said. Just that. Nanlu looked at her daughter, smiled. That full mother's smile that sees her child well and needs nothing more than that to be at peace. "I came to see where you work," she said. "I came to see if the place deserved my daughter." The kitchen nook fell quiet for a second. "And?" Elsa asked, her voice slightly choked. Nanlu looked at Hugh, looked at the window with the simple flowers, looked at her daughter. "It deserves you now," she replied. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet, Hugh sat in the kitchen nook for a while. He looked at the small vase on the window, at the flowers that were already opening more than when he'd put them there. In that way simple flowers have of growing without asking permission or needing an audience. He thought about everything he had lost in those weeks. The illusion of a marriage that had never been real. The trust in someone who had used that trust as a tool. Years of a version of his own life that had been built on false ground. And he thought about everything he had found in the midst of it. A woman who had clapped her hand over his mouth in a dim hallway, not out of disrespect, but because it was the only way she had to say, "Wait, you need to know before you act." A mother who had opened the iron gate without ceremony and assessed him with the eyes of someone who owed nothing to anyone. A security guard who had apologized with the dignity of someone who makes a mistake but doesn't hide from it. And the certainty built day by day, gesture by gesture, in silences that spoke more than speeches, that character doesn't show up in presentations. It shows up in the hours when no one is watching, in the choices no one will know were made, in the video that could have been deleted and wasn't, in the letter kept for weeks in an apron pocket, in the flowers collected from a hallway floor, as if they deserved to end better. Hugh turned off the kitchen nook light, but before leaving, he stopped at the window for one last second. The flowers were there, open, simple, completely in place. Some stories start with a hushed plea in the wrong hallway and end with flowers in the right window.